Hello, I'm Bob Weeks for Wichita Liberty TV, your weekly source for news, analysis, and commentary about Wichita and Kansas government and politics. We're broadcast on KGPT channel 26.1, also its companion website, kgpt26.com. My guest today is Congressman Mike Pompeo. He is in his third term representing the 4th District of Kansas, which is the Wichita metropolitan area and surrounding counties, going west to include Edwards, Kiowa, and Comanche counties, and east to include Greenwood, Elk, and Chautauqua counties. Representative Pompeo went to college at the United States Military Academy at West Point, graduating first in his class and then serving as a cavalry officer patrolling the Iron Curtain before the fall of the Berlin Wall. After earning a law degree, Mike returned to his mother's family roots in south central Kansas and founded Thayer Aerospace, where he served as chief executive officer for more than a decade, providing components for commercial and military aircraft. He then became president of Century International, an oil field equipment and manufacturing, distribution, and service company. Representative Pompeo serves on 2 regular committees, the Energy and Commerce Committee and also the House Intelligence Committee. He was also appointed to the House Special Committee on the events surrounding the 2012 terrorist attack in Benghazi. Now, let's watch my interview with Representative Mike Pompeo. So you were on Wichita Liberty TV, it was last April, about 11 months ago, and so I was thinking about over the past year, what are some of the big stories domestically and in foreign affairs as well? So in the U.S., I guess the big story was, well, maybe for you personally was your reelection, but in that election also there was a shift. There's Senate, which had been in Democratic hands under Harry Reid. It now has a Republican majority. Is that probably about the biggest story domestically, do you think?
Yeah, I think that's the biggest story, and the story, I think, is really about the American people again saying we think America's headed the wrong direction. I mean, you think of 9 seats flipping, and you think a small number 9, but that's historic, and it went to places. It's not just 9 folks that turned over in seats that were conservative places. We won Senate seats in Colorado and other places that you might not expect Republicans could win. It was a broad swath of
Maryland, even, wasn't it?
We have the governors in Massachusetts, the governor's mansion in Massachusetts. It's a pretty remarkable election.
Mm-hmm. So there had always been, I don't know how many times I've seen the Speaker of the House, John Boehner, say, we passed these bills, Harry Reid just sits on them in the Senate. So now, Congress has only been in session about 2 months, but are things moving through the Senate now better, or what do you see in the future?
We're still running into a bit of a train wreck. Mm-hmm. Look, in fairness to the new members and they're getting their sea legs under them, and so it's been 8 weeks. They've all got to do the things to get their staff up and running and their team built. But they have a 60-vote rule over the United States Senate. We have already stacked up a couple of dozen bills over there. Many of the things we passed last time that I'm confident we will ultimately get through the Senate, and I know have 55 or 58 votes in the Senate. They've not yet been able to get to. Keystone might be the best example to date. The president vetoed it. I think it had 57 or 58 votes in the Senate.
So not enough for an override.
And so not enough to override. They've tried to override it once. They're going to do it again. But the president has so far been able to hold his 45 members together pretty well, and I'm hopeful that won't continue.
Mm-hmm. Now, in foreign affairs or overseas, I think last spring when you were here, I don't think the average person have heard of the Islamic State or ISIS or ISIL, whatever it is. That really just blew up all of a sudden. More broadly, the situation in the Middle East, is that probably about the biggest story worldwide, do you think, as far as America's interests?
I'd say 2 stories. The story in the Middle East and then the story with Russia would be the 2 things that have changed the most dramatically in the last 24 months from an international perspective and in a perspective of American security. Mm-hmm.
So with regard to ISIL or the Islamic State, and I guess the other thing is Iran manufacturing an atomic weapon. Is that a real threat that we have? We had the visit of the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, very concerned about that. Is there a real threat to America from Iran having an atomic weapon?
There is. It would be very bad for us here in Kansas if Iran gets an atomic weapon. It's It's in part because they would have leverage to engage in activities where it's very difficult to say, hey, I'd stop Iran, because they'll say, well, we'll use our nuclear. So there's second-order effects. Mm-hmm. The other thing that has already begun to take place, as this president has as much as acknowledged he's going to let Iran enrich nuclear material and continue at least some of the work on centrifuges, which gives them the chance to get there, is that you have seen half a dozen other states in the Middle East now say that they too want to have nuclear weapons. Mm-hmm. And that proliferation, that extension of those who have the capacity to inflict this enormous magnitude of harm that come with nuclear power presents real risk. You'll have more risk that some terrorist organization ends up with a nuclear weapon in their hands. And so it's not just the mere fact that you have the Iranian regime with a nuclear weapon. That's certainly bad enough. But the second-order impacts on us here in the United States are very real.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, we're not really worried that Iran doesn't have intercontinental missiles that can, or bombers that can fly such a bomb to America. So it would be detonated somewhere in the Middle East or something, but that could start a big war in some way. Is that the real threat, do you think? Or
that's certainly the risk, the much greater risk. But it is also the case that today these weapons aren't as big as three houses any longer. And so it is the case that there are many delivery mechanisms beyond just a strategic bomb or even just an intercontinental ballistic missile. You can imagine having this nuclear material capable of being triggered from a much smaller device that came to America in some other way. Mm-hmm.
These people want to do that. I mean,
and what's very clear, that's the right question, I think, Bob. What's very clear is that Iran wants very much to expand its power and its empire. Today they control not only their capital of Iran, Tehran, but they control Beirut in large degree. They control Damascus. They control Sana'a, Libya, and now have enormous influence in Baghdad, Iraq as well. They have certainly flexed their muscle, and America has done almost nothing to respond to it.
And is that simply, I wanted to say it's because President Obama doesn't seem to want to have a big role for America overseas, but then I thought, well, he bombed Libya, he's a lot of drone strikes and everything, so he's willing to do some things, but is it just incompetence, do you think, or what's the problem?
Yeah, it goes. I wish it was just simple incompetence, because simple incompetence people can learn, and you can educate, and organizations can build around leaders' shortcomings, except when it's the case that the president and I think his administration have come to believe that Iran is not the threat that I think most people believe. Indeed, it's not a partisan issue. Mm-hmm. There are 90 senators, 350 or 375 members of the House that know that this is wrong and would rather put sanctions on Iran rather than the path that we're headed down. The president sees Iran as a stabilizing factor in the Middle East. I'm convinced of it. When you see the things he has done to allow them to extend their authority with almost no resistance, I don't know exactly what's in his head, but his actions certainly indicate that he thinks Iran as more of a partner than a threat.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks for that, Representative Pompeo. We need to take a moment off for a commercial break. I'm Bob Weeks on Wichita Liberty TV with Congressman Mike Pompeo. Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks with Representative Mike Pompeo. So, Representative Pompeo, you've been appointed to the Special Committee on Benghazi. You've been in the news several times this week regarding the Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, former Secretary of State, her email messages, which I think, besides just being kind of a general scandal, does have an impact upon the business that your Benghazi committee is trying to do. Is that right?
We have a very focused mission. It is, and we've been on it now for 8 months, and it has been a slog, to be honest with you. Our mission is to get all the facts around the events surrounding the death of 4 Americans. 2.5 years ago, September 11th, 2012.
Well, yeah.
And we've been told repeated times, we've asked for documents, we've asked for witnesses, and we have been stonewalled, and there have been delays. And sometimes we've been told you have all the documents, and each time we've been told that, we identify something and we ask a question only to find that we don't have all of the documents. The case of the former secretary's emails is exactly that. We knew of this personal email a few months back, and we've been asking about it, and no one at the State Department ever bothered to tell us that not only did she have a personal email, but she only had a personal email. We were looking for her official, her .gov emails, and didn't see anything, and so we've been asking. Anyway, it's very important that we get to the bottom of this. It is very important that we get all the relevant data, all the relevant facts. I don't know where it leads. I don't know what all we find out. But we have a mission and a task, and I regret greatly that former Secretary Clinton has not been cooperative in helping us get all the access to all the information that we need to do that.
And I had been wondering about the committee because I thought, well, I haven't really heard any news about it, but I think you explained it to Andrea Mitchell, I think it was, on MSNBC, that that's the style of the committee, that you're not going to drip out information slowly. You're going to wait till you're finished and then do some sort of report. Is that right?
Yeah. Look, Republicans are always critical when Democrat investigations leak and they put a little story out or they tell half the side, they get one document and just shove it out there and let the media go crazy about it. Mm-hmm. Chairman Gowdy and other Republican members and I all believe that our task isn't about politics. Our task is to do our work, and we'll do it. It's a little more quiet than, and some get frustrated that they aren't hearing that we're working. But make no mistake, we have been hard at it for all of this time. We've made some progress. There's a lot left to do. It now looks like it's going to take us several months longer than I had thought it might. But we're going to do it until we're done. Okay. And it is the case. There'll be hearings. There'll be more frequent opportunities for us to be in public with witnesses that are important for the American people to hear in the course of this spring and summer. But as far as the committee doing its work, we're going to do our work the way a good investigation is done, in private, and then present all that we've learned in a comprehensive report, and then allow all the American people to see it and judge our work and what happened that night.
Okay. This week, I think it was on Monday, there's the Club for Growth. I know you're familiar with them, a group that, they say limited government Americans who share in the belief that prosperity and opportunity come from economic freedom. And you and another Kansas representative, Tim Huelskamp, were, along with 6 other members of the House, achieved perfect scores on their scorecards. So I wanted to ask about scorecards in general. Are they useful, do you think, for citizens like myself and others to look at those scorecards?
So, I'd say that they are. But I would tell you how I would suggest that people use them. Everyone can do what they'd like. But I'll bet there are 80 scorecards out there.
Lots of groups.
Lots of groups participate in this. The Sierra Club, the Environmental Defense Fund. Everybody's all across the political spectrum. And I think if you look at any one scorecard, you might well misinterpret how your representative is voting or not understand who they are or what they're doing. But I do think if you look at them cumulatively and are willing to spend a little bit of time digging out underneath just that top line score of 62 or 89, I think they can be indicative of how your member of Congress is voting and how they're behaving. Are they living up to the promises that they told you that they would keep? And so I wouldn't overemphasize any one group's. I hear people all the time, they'll say, oh, I saw it. I'm not happy, Mike. You got a 29 on some group. And I always just say, that's true, but please take a look at these half a dozen others or these 40 others and then form your judgment. They can be part of an evaluation of how a member of Congress is behaving. The last thing to say is they are also useful in that a lot of times, Heritage would be a good example. There are some other groups that would be an example that they do a lot of analysis on legislation as well. And so when it is the case that they say, hey, we think members ought to vote yes or no on a particular piece of legislation, it's informative to members because we can go look and say, not I'm going to vote no because Heritage said to vote. No, that's ludicrous. I don't know any members that vote because some organization told them that was the right vote. But it is worth saying, hey, this must be important. And this must be something that they have evaluated, and I trust some of their academics and their policy scholars. Let's go make sure we take a good look at this and get it right.
Because, you always hear people say, I'm going to go to Congress and read every bill, every last word. But some of these bills are just, first of all, they're lengthy, but then they can be section so-and-so is modified, this word changed to here, and who knows what that really means. So, you can rely on you have staff yourself, but even then they must be overwhelmed at times.
You've probably read more than most have, Bob. You probably spend more time than most citizens do. We try to read it all. It is incomprehensible sometimes to read the actual language of the bill because it'll say insert X, and if it's no, it changes 180. It flips completely the meaning of the paragraph, and so you have to go back to the original. And so there's complexity there. So we do read summaries. We do read pieces of the legislation that have been pulled out that are particularly relevant. The good news is by the time you've been in Congress 4 years, a lot of this language you've seen before. And so not everything's new every time. And so you get a chance to read through most all of it. But it is helpful to have others provide you with information and point you to particular places in legislation that they say, hey, you ought to pay particular attention to Section X because that has something that matters to Kansas or to freedom.
And then, of course, not only are the laws big, but then the volumes of regulations. Like, how long ago was Dodd-Frank, the banking regulation, passed, and they're still working on, or the law passed, but they're still working on regulations, I think, to implement it. So
it was passed before my time.
Before your time?
Before my time, and still thousands of pages of regulations that will follow from that statute.
Okay. Well, let's take another moment off for a commercial break. This is Bob Weeks on Wichita Liberty TV. Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks, this week with Congressman Mike Pompeo as my guest. So, Congressman Pompeo, you introduced a bill recently. I think it's called the Grant Return for Deficit Reduction Act. And this is where so much of the time we see federal grants coming either directly to cities, states, and counties, or sometimes it goes through the Kansas Department of Health, Environment, or whatever it is. And those grants have a lot of strings on them, and it leads to spending. And well, let me turn it over to you and let you explain why these grants are bad and what this bill does that might provide a solution.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to talk about this. It's actually really important. So communities sometimes feel if the federal government's going to offer money to them, that they feel compelled to take it, right? It's free, at least as you sit as a city councilman or a county commissioner, it feels free, and yet when you stare at it and you realize what your organization, your community is going to have to do to comply with that grant, you may not be comfortable with that. You may not think that makes sense for your community, and so what I wanted to offer was to say, look, if you decide you don't want to take that, if it doesn't make sense for your community. I wanted to make sure that it didn't just go someplace else, that it wasn't spent money. I wanted county commissioners and city councilmen to know that if they decided that doesn't make sense for us, we're not going to take it, that they were doing a real good thing in doing that. It was not proves that it's not free. It's actually going to reduce the deficit. So if a county decides there's a grant, it's $1 million, we don't want it because of a particular set of strings attached to it, we can return the $1 million. And they need not fear that some other county is going to get that $1 million, but rather it will go towards reducing the United States federal debt.
And that is important because I know I've testified, several times at the city hall or county commission saying, don't spend this. And even Republicans who are generally pretty hawkish on spending, they say, if we don't spend it, it's going to go to somebody else. It's going to be spent one way or the other. And then the strings on top of it and the expense, I think, very expensive. Also, research that shows that these grants have a ratcheting up effect. I think it's because oftentimes a grant funds a program for a couple of years, then people get used to it, the grant ends, but they still want the benefits of that. So,
Bob, this is a little bit of an aside from it, but when you stare at these grants, you'd be surprised how many grants come all across the country, numbers in the thousands, that are grants for $40,000 or $60,000 or $80,000, and they are annual. These are grants that are paying for a person, for an employee, and I am confident that when that ends, when that grant program runs its course, that in many, many cases, the city or the county or the Economic Development Fund or wherever that went continues to keep that employee, and taxpayers continue to pay for it. They may not run the money through Washington at that point, but they've become accustomed to it. They've built that into their operating lifestyle.
Now, another thing that you've been involved with, and this is talking with my wife the other day, she says, I'm not happy about, well, she said something else, but about Representative Mike Pompeo. Why doesn't he want people to know what's in their food? So this is regard to your genetically modified organisms or genetically engineered bill that you have been instrumental in introducing to Congress and had some hearings last year. So people are saying, why doesn't Mike Pompeo want us to know what's in our food? And I don't think that's an accurate assessment, is it?
Yeah. Please tell your wife I desperately want her to know what's in her food.
Okay.
If she wants to know, I would never do anything that would prevent her from knowing what's in her food. And today, that's where we are, right? If you want to eat low-sodium food, you can. If you want to consume foods that you can know if that's what you're consuming. If you want to know if the food you're eating contain genetically engineered components. A company can put that on the label, and you can say, I'm not going to buy a particular food product unless it's on the label.
Because I do see lots of things that are labeled GMO free.
Sure, no, they're out there, and companies are very successful in marketing that particular business. People are willing to pay a premium for that many times, and I don't see anything wrong with it. I think that's the market's function, to provide information and let consumers make choices for themselves. I think that's working perfectly. What I'm worried about and what this legislation is aiming to do is I don't want the federal government telling private industry what they have to put on their food label. If it's unsafe, if there's a risk to health, then we shouldn't just label it, we should ban it. And so we have now decades of testing on genetically engineered foods. They have been shown to be equally safe with their non-genetically engineered counterparts. That hearing that we had was largely about that. 6 witnesses, many of whom opposed me on the bill, but each of whom testified that yes, it's not a health or safety risk. And once you move out of that domain, I just can't understand why Washington, D.C. should tell a farmer in Kansas or a food producer in Idaho, no, you have to put a label on your food that says your food contains something that isn't harmful. It's a dangerous path to go down when we start having mandatory labels for things that are really consumer preferences.
And there's also the issue of the state-by-state regulation. Isn't that another big part of it, too, that certain states may have different regulations, and it would be very difficult for farmers and food manufacturers to comply with all of that?
It's even a little bit worse than that. Many cities have talked about putting food labels on to requiring these things, and it's not always just genetically engineered. They'll say, we don't want foods that have... thing that
sugar. Yeah, we have some cities with tax on sodas.
We do. Every time I see the label of my Captain Crunch, I'm reminded that I shouldn't have the second bowl. But in any event, it is always dangerous when you take interstate commerce and you allow particular localities to try and cramp the capacity of commerce to flow. I'm a deep believer that we should let state and local government do just about anything they want.
Well, I think in your op-ed that appeared in the Wichita Eagle on this matter, you mentioned what if each state had their own regulations involving aircraft instead of just one, the FAA? Would a Kansas-built plane be able to fly into a California airport, something like that?
It's that same kind of issue. There are things that our founders knew deeply. It's why they put an interstate commerce clause in the Constitution, that there were certain things that had to be governed by a set of uniform rules across the entire union. And food labeling has historically been that, and has served us pretty well.
Okay. Well, Representative Mike Pompeo, thanks
Thank
for appearing on Wichita Liberty TV. We're out of time this week, so please visit us next week on Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks.